Zenless Zone Zero contains a lot of animation, and I have a lot of nice things to say about it. Very few game studios are delivering on a 3D anime aesthetic at this level, and I love that MiHoYo has clearly gone for a different animation style this time around. It would be so easy for them to just stick with the house style they're already comfortable with, but they pushed outside their comfort zone on this one, and I applaud that. It really helps to visually set Zenless Zone Zero apart from the rest of their catalog. And I love how much this game is using animation as a major selling point. So many gacha games, even MiHoYo gacha games, lean predominantly on character design to drive appeal, with the animation on those characters generally being a secondary priority. But they are clearly going harder with animation this time, and I am here for it. Also, the combat gameplay animation in this game looks so absurdly cool. Look at this! This is very likely showing up in my Best of the Year roundup for 2024. I think it is easily MiHoYo's best gameplay animation work to date. There is so much to praise here, but at the same time, I think there are also some worthwhile animation critiques to be made, and they're the sort of critiques that I usually, and understandably, don't see happening within gaming fandom very often. To put it simply, Zenless Zone Zero has an overanimation problem. Overanimation is a tricky thing to explain because it's the kind of nebulous aesthetic critique that usually only gets discussed in animation classrooms or among animation peers, but I will try my best. In the broadest terms possible, overanimation is motion without purpose, and that can take a lot of forms. Sometimes it's animation which includes tons of superfluous movement or distracting visual noise. Sometimes it's an animator trying to squeeze 5 key poses into a shot which really only needs 2. Sometimes it's hammy acting animation that pantomimes emotions rather than depicting a character genuinely feeling them. Sometimes it's just an animator using every single animation principle they know at all times on every movement, whether that principle is called for or not. Big arcs on every single part of the body, big exaggerated anticipation and squash and stretch and overlap everywhere. This is a thing that you'll often see in the work of animation students. They're learning what all of these principles and techniques are, but they haven't yet developed the intuition for how or where to use those techniques most effectively. So they just kind of use them all over the place at maximum volume. We have all done this at one point, probably lots of times. Even among professionals, it is very common. The simple truth is, more animation is not always the same thing as better animation. Like, of course it's not. That would be like saying great film editing is about squeezing in the most cuts per minute, or that more notes per measure equals better music composition. Sure, lots of notes can be great, but the rests between them are just as important. Now, to some of you, this might sound like the sort of criticism that's really more of a subjective opinion. I mean, different animated projects can have very different styles and tones, right? Isn't this just a question of personal or creative taste? And to an extent, you're right. What overanimation looks like is going to vary from project to project, and animation which might look way too exaggerated in one context may feel just right in another. But it's also important to remember that it is very possible to execute on a chosen style poorly, and there are fundamentals of animation craft which continue to apply regardless of one style. Still, it can be pretty hard to recognize overanimation without experience and a trained eye, and even then, not all animators will agree. What I'm trying to say here is that the stuff I'm going to talk about in this video is not a facet of animation quality which can be easily measured in consistent, objective terms. So instead, we get to dive into the weeds of peer critique.
Welcome to hell.
You are now entering Nitpick Land. Population insufferable. Welcome to New Frame Plus. Just so everyone can get their bearings, let me give you a quick tour of Zenless Zone Zero's character animation contents. The majority of the game's animation exists across a few specific modes: combat, exploration, menus, conversation sequences, and cinematics. Combat is the game's most animation-intensive mode, and by far the most successful. It is so good. Every playable character has a unique moveset. The action is all quite over the top, but in a good way. It looks good, it feels good, it delivers on flashy anime action spectacle without sacrificing gameplay clarity, and it gives each character a chance to show off what makes them uniquely special. This is all excellent. No notes. Please keep doing what you are doing. There's also exploration, where you can wander these little hub areas, visit shops, and talk to NPCs. The animation here mostly consists of your character's locomotion and a bunch of ambient background activity. Plus a bunch of little cute touches thrown in, like the way this little thing runs security at the door to your back room. I don't know why, I love this little guy so much. There's also quite a lot of character animation when navigating menus, whether you are unlocking new characters in the gacha machine, or fiddling with their loadouts, or sometimes just as a bit of background activity. I very much like the way that your characters shift to different poses in these submenus. It's very stylish, very Persona, it's very good. Then, when you are playing through the campaign, you will experience most of the game's story in these simple conversation sequences / awkward Zoom calls. Each of the characters have a handful of mood poses they'll shift between from line to line, a handful of expressions. They're basically a 3D incarnation of those character portraits you often see in RPGs or visual novels. And then, on rare occasion, when it's time for some action or a new character introduction, you will be shown a fully animated and very flashy cinematic. Now, I think that there are some minor examples of overanimation scattered across all of these modes. Like, this floaty, keep alive motion they constantly put on these characters anytime they have to hold a pose is very swimmy. Now, I do get why it is here. A complete lack of motion would be worse. It would just make them feel dead. And using lots of flapping motion on hair and clothes to keep otherwise static characters feeling alive is, like, that's anime aesthetic 101. Even so, I don't love this execution. It's one thing having that floaty, drifting texture on loose extremities, but having it on the character's torso and center of gravity just makes them feel weightless. It looks like every character's trying to hold a pose while submerged in a wave pool. And I'd level some similar criticisms at the application of real-time physics on these characters across the entire game. Having some dynamic overlap and follow-through on your character's hair and jackets and jiggly bits is good, it helps them feel organic, but this is a lot. And I'm not even specifically talking about the fan service-y aspect either. Horniness aside, the large amount of overlap on every single clump of hair or loose bit of clothing on these characters layers a significant amount of white noise motion on top of everything these characters do, especially if they're moving a lot. This brings me to the game's cinematics, which contain, I think, the game's biggest animation problems. And as I say that, I imagine some of you probably think I am out of my mind. And I can understand that, because look at this. Are these shots not filled with the kind of stylized, exaggerated animation I am so often praising on this channel? Heck, a significant number of the tens of millions of people who have played Zenless Zone Zero probably downloaded the game in the first place because they saw how cool the animation in these cinematics looks. And I get it, because there is a lot of cool-looking animation here. These action sequences are so fun to look at. Like, you could make a fair argument for this being empty eye candy, the animation equivalent of style over substance, but while I do fully agree that there is a very important difference between great character animation and animation which just looks eye-catching and cool, I also think that it's okay to just enjoy style for style's sake sometimes, especially when that style's being delivered at an exceptionally high level of skill. Anime action is fun spectacle, and I legitimately think Zenless Zone Zero delivers on that brand of 3D anime spectacle better than most. For me, the issues start when that style over substance approach starts bleeding into characters' acting, because that is where overanimation has the potential to cause much more significant problems. So let's talk about problems. The character performances in these cinematics tend to be very animated, very exaggerated, and that's not inherently bad, at all. I really do want to stress I am a fan of what they are attempting to do here. In execution, though, a lot about this attempt is falling short. There are a lot of stock animation and acting cliches to be found in these performances. A lot of characters pantomiming emotions, rather than expressing them. Now, to be fair, anime is an art that thrives on tropes and archetypes, and that's fine. There is nothing inherently bad or flawed about using a trope. But when it comes to animated acting, leaning too hard into the performance cliches associated with those tropes can be a problem. And some of these shots are like watching an acting cliché speedrun. Like, how many moe poses can you squeeze into 5 seconds? These acting issues are further exacerbated by the overly enthusiastic use of exaggeration. Exaggeration is one of the 12 fundamental principles of animation. I'll get around to making a video dedicated to it someday, but to give the short version, exaggeration is about pushing the movement and posing in your animation beyond realism in order to maximize its clarity, personality, or visual appeal. It's a very important element in all animation, anime very much included. And given the game's comedic tone, it makes complete stylistic sense for Zenless Zone Zero to lean into using exaggeration more heavily. But as with all of the animation principles, execution matters, and frankly, there is a lot of exaggeration in these shots in places where it doesn't really belong. Exaggerating the movement in a high-energy action shot or a comedic double-take is one thing, but even casual conversation in these scenes is so often given these big, exaggerated arcs, exaggerated anticipation, exaggerated overlap. These are important animation principles, yes, but it's important for the animator to also know where they aren't needed. Even when you are working within an exaggerated style, if you are hitting every single line at maximum energy and emotion, the resulting performance is going to feel less sincere, and also just be kind of exhausting to look at after a while. Some of these shots almost look like those TikToks you see of people imitating the movement of animated characters. To be clear, I like these. What these creators are doing is really impressive. But if you're an animator, and this might sound counterintuitive, you generally don't want your animated acting to resemble this. Because the thing is, these performers are themselves already doing an exaggerated imitation. They are imitating recognizable cliches about the ways we've all seen animated characters act. So if the performances you're animating resemble an exaggerated imitation of a cliché, that's probably not a good sign. And these overanimation issues are not helped by the faces in these cinematics. For some reason, there is a noticeable mismatch in the level of exaggeration being applied to the body compared to the facial expressions. Anime faces have incredible capacity for emotional expression, from the extreme to the subtle. And these expressions just aren't fully delivering at either end of that spectrum. And then there's the issue of clarity. In their attempt to infuse these scenes with more rapid, over-the-top energy, which is then further amplified by the real-time physics causing every movement to cascade down every loose or bouncy extremity these characters have, the animators have filled a lot of these shots with unnecessarily distracting motion, a near constant barrage of visual noise. Good animation, like good cinematography, directs your eye. It uses motion to draw your focus to specific places in the frame, uses stillness where necessary to avoid distracting that focus, or sometimes to give your eyes a chance to absorb a visual before it changes. And these cinematics, in their eagerness to pack in stylish motion, are frequently sabotaging their own ability to do that. I saw another animator describe all of this overanimation as the equivalent of jangling keys at a baby, which is a little harsher than I'd have put it, but I mean, yeah, a little bit. Even within a heavily exaggerated and stylized aesthetic, this is overanimation. This is a lot of movement without purpose, style over substance. There is a difference between exaggerated acting that conveys genuine emotion and emotional pantomime that merely hits a lot of cute poses along the way. More movement does not always mean better animation. But okay, counterpoint, who cares? You might reasonably ask, why would this matter to anyone other than animation snobs with YouTube channels, who make weird choices about how to spend their time on this earth? Well, first of all, hurtful, but second, I do actually think that these issues have a detrimental cumulative effect on Zenless Zone Zero that is worth understanding, especially for anybody wanting to be an animator or make video games. What kinds of problems? Well, problem number 1. This overanimation creates noticeable stylistic inconsistency. I've been saying that Zenless Zone Zero has a cartoony, over-the-top animation aesthetic, but that's not really true. The cinematics do, but the rest of the game's animation looks quite different. The combat's anime action probably comes closest, but unless you're seeing a short cinematic, all of the animation in the hub world is pretty chill and contained, about the same as what you'd see in any other MiHoYo game. And the animation in the conversation sequences almost looks like it was made for an entirely different video game. Not because the characters are holding relatively static poses, that's obviously on purpose, but those poses and expressions are so neutral and reserved by comparison. Nothing at all the way most of these gremlins start behaving when the cinematics hit. And it would be one thing if this enormous difference was being deployed to create dynamic contrast, like keeping the performances and the posing more reserved during lower energy scenes, and then ramping up the exaggerated energy for moments of excitement or tension or comedy. But that's not quite what's happening here. Every one of these sequences, no matter what the energy of the line reads or what is happening in the scene, looks like this.
Going straight forward. Brace for impact.
We're gonna crash! We're gonna crash! We're gonna crash!
Meanwhile, a relatively calm conversation in a cinematic is being animated like this.
Did that hacker's message really come from the holo?
It's jarring watching a character behave like this for 5 minutes of conversation, and then suddenly be animated like this for 20 seconds, and then go right back to this. It's weird.
This guy's had a complete change of personality.
It's happening all the time. Characters going from this to this, and then right back to this. It feels like some other, more hyperactive character with a completely different personality is just taking control for a second. The character looks the same, they sound the same, but their animated behavior just does not match. Now, again, I do understand that these are intentionally designed to be simpler sequences, which can deliver large quantities of story dialogue in a more budget-friendly way, and that's fine. Zenless is hardly the only game that has to resort to simpler, cost-efficient sequences to tell the bulk of its story. But plenty of the other games that do this have figured out ways to make the animation in those simple sequences and the more robust cutscenes feel like they aesthetically belong together. Heck, in some games, it's very hard to tell which kind of scene is which sometimes. One of the many responsibilities of an animation lead or an animation director is to guide the aesthetic execution of the project, especially if all of your animators are siloed on different teams working on different parts of the game, possibly even in different studios. And I don't know what animation production on this game looks like, but whatever their pipeline, looking at these results, it kind of feels like a fumble happened somewhere. Problem 2. All this overanimation hinders the game's ability to make these characters feel distinct. There is so much characterization potential to be mined by emphasizing contrast between characters. Like, if you're an animator and you're about to start animating a new character for the first time, you might start your brainstorming process with some really broad questions, like, is this character light or heavy? Are they fast or slow? Are they energetic or lethargic? Are they loud or quiet? Are they thoughtful or brash? You get the idea. And sure, any one of those given traits is pretty broad, it's really just a starting point, but two characters with a very different combination of answers to those questions are likely to be pretty different from each other, and animation can emphasize that in the ways that different characters move, their posing, their attitude, their expressions. And you can see this happening in Zenless Zone Zero to some extent. Like, Billy's posing and attitude feel quite different from Anby's. Lycon's stern poise feels very different from Corin's timid anxiety. But because so many of these characters are overanimated in similar ways during cinematics, it kind of flattens that range of contrast potential. Are there subtle distinctions to be made in the body language and the animated energy of characters like Nicole, Nekomata, and Grace? Yeah, definitely to some degree. But in practice, those differences are not nearly as noticeable as the contrast between these characters and themselves in cinematics. Which brings me to Problem 3. For all of their exaggeration, these overanimated performances are failing to give any of these characters genuine depth. By investing so many resources into animation, Zenless Zone Zero has the opportunity to make its characters so much more compelling than those found in other gacha games, because animation can show you so much more about a character. Their behavior, their body language, the ways they visually express or try to hide their emotions. But because these performances are leaning so hard on tropes and overanimated cliches, all their acting is really able to emphasize is which familiar archetypes each character is derived from. Which is fine, but it means that their animation's not providing them nearly as much personality as it could, isn't able to elevate them beyond that surface impression you get the first time you see them. See, the problem with acting cliches is that they're superficial. They're obvious, they're predictable. And good animated acting can deliver so much more than that. The illusion of life that we animators are always going on about isn't just about taking a non-living object like a digital model or a drawing or a physical puppet and making them move around almost like living things do. That's part of it, but the real illusion of life happens when you can make that object express an emotion that actually feels sincere, where the artifice of it all just fades into the background, and in that moment, the people watching don't see a puppet or a moving drawing anymore, but an actual living character looking back at them through the screen, with thoughts of their own and feelings and desires. A living, breathing character. That is the illusion. That's the magic animators are always striving to capture. Now, is it some dire failing that Zenless Zone Zero's character animation doesn't often achieve that? No. Frankly, a lot of game animation doesn't. But it is a bigger missed opportunity for any game that's built around the appeal of its cast. Even more so for a game that's literally trying to monetize that cast's desirability. Okay, but what if, after listening to all of that from me, what if you still feel like, well, I still like it. I think it's good. That is okay. I've been doing a lot of nitpicking here, but while I do genuinely think that the animation in this game's cinematics has some significant shortcomings, you are not wrong, or an idiot, or anything if you like this. In fact, I guarantee you, there are at least a couple professional animators who are very good at their job watching this who agree with you and think that my criticisms of this are absurd. Animation is an art that has been explored and refined for more than a century at this point, but when it comes to aesthetic critiques like these, subjective tastes are still genuinely a variable that you have to factor in. But if you are an animator, or if you aspire to be someday, I would strongly encourage you to not be too quick to write off these sorts of criticisms as mere differences in stylistic taste. There is a reason why so many veteran animators around the world have spent so much time and so much effort trying to help younger animators recognize overanimation in their own work. Because animation that moves in cool, eye-catching ways is awesome, but great character animation is about so much more than that and can achieve so much more than that. And recognizing this is an important step in pushing your craft to the next level as an animator. Stylish overanimation can do a lot of things. It can make combat flashy, it can make fight cutscenes exciting, and it can make characters look attractive. But it's not very useful for creating that illusion of life, for animating a performance that feels genuine and real, the kind an audience will emotionally connect with and get invested in and remember for years. In fact, if creating that emotional connection is your goal, then the pursuit of style for style's sake is gonna undermine your efforts every single time. Look, I am not trying to convince you that this doesn't look cool. It absolutely does. But appealing motion and style alone aren't enough to breathe real life into an animated character, to elevate them beyond the stock archetype and cute design they started as. All of that said, there is very clearly a lot of talent working on this team, and the animation in MiHoYo's games has gotten better and better every year. I think Zenless Zone Zero's animation still has a lot of room to improve, but this game is going to keep growing, and one nice thing about working on a live service game is that every new character and content update is an opportunity to raise the bar a little higher. And I hope they do, because as cool as this game's animation already looks, there is a lot more potential still buried in this cast, just waiting to be let out. Even more than usual, I would like to sincerely thank you for listening to my animator rambling. I'm always a little nervous getting this deep into the weeds on aesthetic critique on this channel. Even if you don't agree with me, I hope that this was at least interesting. And if it wasn't interesting, then I hope it at least made sense. God, I hope this made sense. You know, whatever, I got a very large video I'm still working on. I need to get back to it. I'll see you guys later. Bye!